To start us off this morning, we have the new president of Grand Rapids Community College, Dr. Stephen Ender.
Well, good morning. Good morning. There's someone out there, I hope. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the next 3 days of programming as our institution launches an inaugural event. I will tell you that I came here in February to interview for this position, and there were a lot of activities going on around Black History Month. And my past experiences at 3 or 4 different educational institutions, typically those programming ideas and actual programs come out of the Division of Student Affairs or Student Life. And what caught my eye pretty quickly is these activities have been planned and orchestrated by our Department of Social Sciences. And I thought that's kind of what should be going on, that somehow we integrate our academic and our co-curricular so that we can help students see the linkages between what they're seeing and participating in, what they're learning in a classroom, and what does it mean about me as a person. And now we are launching the History of Gender and Sexuality Symposium, and it's another just outstanding example that reinforces for me when I say GRCC is a university education provided in a community college culture and philosophy. And I truly, really do not think it gets any better than that. Students, the types of programming that you'll participate in the next 3 days really will ask you to examine, I think, some of your beliefs and values and some of your concept of a worldview around issues of sexuality and gender. That just typically doesn't happen in a format of a symposium at a community college. So I think you should really feel justified and extremely pleased with your decision to have selected this institution. Programs like this just don't happen. People put a lot of time and effort into thinking through what they're trying to do, thinking through who could best help us do these things, identifying who those people are and getting them to this campus. I know Bob Hendershot has been actually very involved with this, but every program has some little spark plug behind it. And in the case of this program, I understand that would be Professor Susan Williams, who is with us now for your second year. Is that correct? It speaks very highly, I think, of a young faculty member to take on not only that teaching load and other committees and assignments that the institution has for all of our faculty, but then to embrace a program like this and put the work into it that I know requires. So I want to express my thanks to you and Bob for making this 3-day event happen. A little bit about Susan, who's going to introduce our first speaker. Holds an MA, Modern and Early Modern European History from the University of Cincinnati. Currently working on, and I hope will soon complete, her PhD in East European History, and that is from the Indiana University of Bloomington. Another little just fact about, I think, who Susan is. She supported herself through her graduate program through Fulbright and Mellon scholarships and fellowships, and those are not easy to obtain, and they're just not given to anyone. So congratulations for that accomplishment. So without any further ado, let me again welcome you, encourage you to actively participate, and now introduce soon-to-be Dr. Susan Williams from our Social Science Department. Susan.
Show that I'm short. by pulling down the microphone. So thank you all so much for coming. This has been a symposium that's been about 3 months in the works now. We're really excited to be able to share all of these events and all of these really great speakers with you. And thanks, Dr. Ender, for that really nice introduction and the things that you said. I think that this is going to be great for our college and our students. So I want to thank you all for coming. I want to welcome you to the first day of our symposium. I also want to thank a few of the people that actually made this possible, including, of course, the college itself, our social science department, very active, and as Mike DeVivo will tell you, is the best department in the world. I also want to thank particularly Steve Abed and Bob Hendershot and Mike Light, who are my colleagues on the symposium committee. Patty Trubkowski in the Interdisciplinary Studies Department, our Provost's office, the Woodrick Diversity Learning Center. They have a great speaker coming on Wednesday night at 7 o'clock, Eric Alva, who's also part of our program as well. And also our GRCC Catering Department, and I thank them because they came up with this really great idea for a reception on Tuesday, and if you can make it, you have to come, because it's 6 o'clock, it'll be here. In that atrium outside, and we're actually doing a celebration of the work of Julia Child, and so it's a food tasting, and it's free, so you should all come. Stacy Herrick, and of course all of our speakers who have just come up with this really great program of presentations. So we have 3 days of really exciting events planned, and I hope to see you all there. And just to introduce some of the themes that you're going to see and why we're doing this conference in the first place. Traditionally, from the 1960s and 1970s, that's when you have the start of your women's studies programs at universities and at colleges. But in the early 1990s, there was a historian named Joan Scott, and she outlined the premise that gender is a useful category of analysis. And just to give you a sense of how that works, Simone de Beauvoir has a great quote. One is not born a woman, one becomes one, and thus one is not born a man, right? One becomes one. So gender is often used mistakenly as a term that denotes biological sex, i.e. a man or a woman. In reality, gender denotes the cultural and social construction, as well as the performance of masculinities and femininities. Sexuality is a little bit trickier than gender to define. While sexuality is partially rooted in biology, desire and the politics of desire is likewise socially and culturally constructed and performed. Now, these terms are not immersed in biology, nor are they static, as you're going to see with all of our presenters this week. Concepts of gender and sexuality shift due to time, place, and space. So depending on the time period, depending on the culture that you're talking about, depending on the concerns of that society. This week, we have speakers from a variety of disciplines, people who are going to be talking about literature, political science, history, writing about different periods and cultures. And we will see the roles and the behaviors, the identities, the activities, and the attributes that these specific societies denote as appropriate to men and women. Gender and sexuality are useful categories of analysis, as all of our presentations will speak directly to. And ultimately, the purpose of this conference is that we have to be aware of how people historically understood these concepts so that we can better understand ourselves and our communities, and we can be better citizens from it. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Laurie Chesley. She's one of our Associate Deans of Arts and Sciences here at GRCC. She earned her PhD in English Literature from the University of Notre Dame in 1994. Her area of specialization was 18th century British prose. She taught English at the at the college level for 14 years before moving into administration. And today she is presenting a paper entitled Women Behaving Badly, an examination of conduct literature from Daniel Defoe to Dr. Laura. Please help me welcome her.
Thank you, Susan. We have to begin this in good 18th century fashion, because we're going to spend a lot of time today in our talk in, what's called the Restoration in 18th century. So I need to say to you, good morning, persons of quality. I am your humble servant. And some of you know I use this phrase all the time, persons of quality, but you might not know what it refers to. What it really refers to in the Restoration in 18th century are people of the upper classes. I know that talking about people of the upper classes as the only persons of quality is kind of offensive to the modern audience, so please understand that I mean it in a very democratic way. We are all persons of quality, and in presenting some of this material to you today, I am your humble servant, which means I am here to try to help you, answer your questions, and hopefully make you as fond of this period and this kind of literature as I am. There will definitely be some time for question and answer during our talk as well, okay? So I'd like to start out with asking you a little bit about what you may already know about the Restoration in 18th century. And I'm so excited, I'm pressing the ahead button. I can't help myself, I love this period. What do you know about the Restoration in 18th century? Any authors you know of? Any historical trends you know of? And I do happen to know there are historians in this audience. Okay, well, you'll learn a little today. You know, I will tell you, in the great field of literary studies, sometimes the 18th century is ignored. And it's an acquired taste. So we'll see if I can't help you acquire some of that. Yes, some of you are nodding, going, yes, I remember that. We'll see if I can't help you acquire a little bit more of a taste for this period. But first, since this talk is about conduct literature, we should probably spend a little time addressing what that actually is, in case you don't know. Occasionally during this talk, I'm going to have to take steps backward in time and forward in time. And my first step is going to be back to Horace, who wrote a very important treatise on literature called the Ars Poetica, the Art of Poetry, in 18 BC, in which he set forth what he believed to be the function of literature. And that function was really twofold. It was to instruct and to entertain. In the Latin, literature should be dulce, sweet, pleasant, entertaining, and utile, useful, utilitarian. Literature then, for Horace, and most definitely for our conduct literature writers, has a strongly didactic purpose. I'll kind of let you decide how entertaining it is as we go along. Okay? The main purpose, though, of conduct literature is didactic. It's to teach a lesson. Make no mistake, nothing fuzzy about it. It's to teach a lesson. The audience for conduct literature before the 18th century was primarily aristocratic males. That changes as the Restoration occurs. It becomes a gradual trend throughout the 18th century that conduct literature becomes primarily a genre for middle-class women. And those of you who've taken history classes know, and forgive me historians in the audience, that in every period of history, the middle class was growing. But I'm assured that in the 18th century, that is absolutely the fact. And I've even read whole books about it. The rise of the middle class in numbers, in importance, as a driver for commerce and literary taste, the middle class becomes much, much more important. And women become much, much more important as consumers of literature. And also, as we see conduct literature become more of a force in publishing, we see that the authors move from being primarily clergymen to primarily lay people. That doesn't mean you won't see the occasional clergyman writing conduct tracts later in the century, but we're talking about some trends here. The term religious in nature, didactic in intent, describes, many authors argue, most published literature in the Restoration and 18th century. Not all of it, but even novels, plays, and most definitely the nonfiction pamphlets and tracts of the time, highly didactic, and frankly in a way that more modern audiences sometimes find unappealing and judgmental. Okay? Definitely this genre of literature, religious in nature, didactic in intent, that literature was the genre that they were the best sellers of the time. Some scholars estimate that there were at least 200 works that could be described in this way published annually. Conduct literature can take many forms. We look at many novels in the 18th century as being conduct literature in a slightly different form. Certainly pamphlets, guidebooks, the kinds of texts from Daniel Defoe that we'll talk about today are conduct literature. You even have terms like conduct manual. Open the book, figure out how you should behave. But the bottom line, after all this, is that conduct literature is literature aimed at teaching people how to behave. And again, the audience is primarily women. Now, not exclusively, but primarily. And so, in general, if we kind of look at what a more modern audience would think of as the positive and the negative sides of conduct literature, certainly its existence indicates that there's a belief that women are rational creatures, that they are educable, that they're capable of making reasoned decisions and can be held accountable for their actions. Well, you're saying, what's shocking about that? Well, I don't think it is shocking to a 21st century audience, but it represents a shift in thinking for this time. Women are not just to be controlled by their husbands or their fathers or the males of the family. Women aren't inherently less intelligent. These views are really changing at this time. You know, and it also indicates, it shows a prevailing view that women should be treated well. That it isn't okay to say, beat your wife. It isn't okay to say, subject and scorn and ignore the women in your family. That doesn't mean equal treatment, by the way, and we'll see that, but it means much better treatment. The negative side, it is essentially conservative in nature, and I don't mean conservative in a political sense. I certainly don't mean that all the conduct writers would be Republicans today or anything like that. I mean conservative in the sense that it doesn't tend to call for radical change. It serves to maintain the status quo in society for, in large part, in the existing social order and existing social hierarchies. Ultimately serves to regulate female desire, desire for independence, desire for all kinds of things, a desire that Professor Williams alluded to and we'll talk more about, the desire for independence, the desire to be the head of the household. Conduct literature serves to quell that. Tends to limit female roles. Although the 18th century is in many ways a progressive time for women, compared to the 21st century, it's not such a progressive time. I mean, you don't, for the most part, have women, making their own way in the world, having careers. Those kinds of things just don't happen. Women are primarily still defined as wives, mothers, defined in relation to men. So conduct literature really serves to further define them, to solidify the existing definitions of society. I need to step back now. I'm going to step back in history again. I'm going to go back to this kind of hazy time and talk about a myth, a classical myth, and it's called The Choice of Hercules. It's one of my favorites. I don't know why, but I love it. And the 18th century loved it. This myth, which I'll explain, is prevalent in much of the popular literature of the time, the popular entertainments. In writing of the time, there are essays written about the choice of Hercules in some of the newspapers of the time. You've probably heard of Steele and Addison's Spectator papers. It's a theme in paintings. It's a theme in literature. George Handel wrote an entire oratorio called The Choice of Hercules. It's a myth which is very prominent in the 18th century psyche. And it's a myth which causes the reader to really focus on choice, obviously, on a dichotomy of virtue versus pleasure. Okay? And so the story goes something like this. Hercules is a young man ready to set out on his life's adventures. He's been well educated by the finest tutors. He's been taught the arts. He's been taught philosophy. He's been taught the martial arts. You know the picture of Hercules is, I think that's the technical term. Okay. So he's ready to go on in his ventures. He's ready to face the world. And so he's walking along, yo-de-do-de-do, and he comes to a place in the road where there are two women. And with the subtlety of classical mythology, they are named virtue and pleasure. And let's talk about pleasure for a minute and what pleasure typically looks like, or at least how she's described and how I would envision her. Voluptuous, scantily clad, probably, pretty made up, or a lot of ornament. She's seductive. She says, "Come here, big guy. You should follow me. Follow my path in life, and you will have pleasure aplenty. You will always be pleased. All the food, wine, ease, women, physical pleasure you could ever want. Come with me and live a life of ease." And then virtue says, don't listen to her. And virtue is much more modestly dressed. Plain, modest, yet attractive, because virtue is attractive. Don't listen to her. If you spend your life following that path, you will never know true joy because you'll never be able to contrast pleasure with the lack of it. You need to follow me. Follow a life in which you do good deeds. Follow a life in which you're an honor to your family. Follow a life in which you're an honor to your country. It will be hard, you will suffer, you will be in pain, but in moments you will know great joy. And the most important of all, you will have eternal life because your reputation will live through the ages. And what do you think Hercules does? Who does he follow? He's Hercules. Virtue, thank you. I mean, of course he must follow virtue. And he does. And virtue is really a life of honor. Honor that's based in doing the societal good. Honor in doing what you ought, not just what you want. Okay, it's not about pleasing yourself. It's about others. It's not about self-interest. And sometimes this conflict is thought about as a conflict between honor and love. I wanted to show you a representation of this choice in a 17th century painting by Carracci. And here you have Hercules in the middle. Virtue is often in these depicted as pointing upward. And she's more modestly clothed. Not so modest. Okay. If we were going to look at this in more modern terms, I'm glad you think that's funny. Enough said. Let's keep in mind the choice of Hercules as we work through some of this material. Daniel Defoe. I want to ask the fellow in the back, am I okay standing here? Am I casting shadows I shouldn't? Think I'm okay? Okay, good. I could also move down here. Is that better or worse?
I would stay up.
Stay up? Okay. I sound like my ophthalmologist. Better or worse? 1 or 2 with the little lenses they show me. Daniel Defoe, prolific 18th century English author. Some of his conduct literature I want to note here, and we'll talk about them, the pieces in more detail. Before I do, though, let me ask, anybody in the audience know Defoe's most famous work? Because it's not one of these. Most famous novel, Shipwreck. Robinson Crusoe, yeah, all right. We've still got TV shows on Robinson Crusoe. His most enduring work, what he's most known for. But I don't think it's the most fun, so we're not going to talk about it today. We're going to talk a little bit about an essay upon projects, and specifically a piece in it called An Academy for Women, which is a proposal for women's education. You might wonder, projects, what does that mean, an essay upon projects? It's actually, projecting was very popular in the 18th century. And it really meant just sort of coming up with schemes, coming up with ideas to improve things, to make money. And so there were entire clubs voted to projecting, projectors clubs. Well, this is an essay by Defoe full of all kinds of ideas to improve society. Oh, it's got, a proposal for new roads, a proposal for, mines, a proposal for all these kinds of interesting things. Right smack in the middle, we need some schools for women. Also want to talk about a journal he wrote for a number of years called The Review. It's the short title. It's essentially the forerunner of today's newspapers, a forerunner of today's newspapers. And then the works we would consider most purely conduct manuals, The Family Instructors, several versions, Religious Courtship, and, this isn't a misprint, Conjugal Lewdness, or Matrimonial Whoredom. That should keep your interest for a while. And of course, a photo of Defoe. I want to talk about An Academy for Women first. And the idea of educating women is not Defoe's alone. There are many other authors who put forward proposals for actual schools or academies for women. But I want to get kind of a flavor of the period here with some of these quotes. I have often thought of it as one of the most barbarous customs in the world, considering us as a civilized and a Christian country, that we deny the advantages of learning to women. We reproach the sex every day with folly and impertinence, while I am confident, had they the advantages of education equal to us, they would be guilty of less than ourselves. The importance of education. And they would be guilty of less than ourselves. If we just educated women, they'd act better than men. Interesting kind of side note. Why is it that in the Restoration and 18th century period, we see an interest in education, a burgeoning interest in public education, and also, another trend, the rise of the British novel. The novel, as we understand it today, really develops in Britain, I'm not talking about elsewhere, in Britain in this time period. It begins with things like Moll Flanders and Robinson Crusoe. Why is that? There are lots of reasons why. But one of the interesting trends that are in the air. I don't want to propose rigid cause and effect, but I want to talk about in the air. We have a number of writers at this time, philosophers of epistemology, the study of how we learn things, the study of how we know things, writing about the influence of experience on what people know, who they are, and who they become. And so you have John Locke, who writes an essay concerning human understanding, the most famous point of which is the notion that we are all, when we are born, tabula rasa, blank slates, upon which experience writes. Well, if you look at 18th century novels and arguably novels beyond them, what are they but the experience of a character, or the life of a character, and seeing how experience shapes them? Many people have tied that interest in how experience shapes people to the rise of the novel as a genre. Of course, that notion of how experience shapes people is really in contrast to an earlier notion that we are just born the way we are, that we have innate ideas, we have an innate temperament, we are innately who we are, and life doesn't change that much. And there's your philosophy lesson for today. I hope the philosophers in the room are not rolling over in their graves, or in your seats. Okay. That wasn't good. I hope the philosophers in the audience are living. Okay. I just like this quote. I was sharing it with my colleague Dan Lerner and getting his opinion on its worth. The whole sex, meaning women, are generally quick and sharp. I believe I may be allowed to say generally so, for you rarely see them lumpish and heavy when they are children, as boys will often be. Lumpish and heavy. I don't know if you've noticed that about little boys as opposed to lumpish and heavy. All right, you're right, that's not funny. That's not a joke I should make. If a woman be well bred and taught the proper management of her natural wit, she proves generally very sensible and retentive. Good to know. Okay. A woman well-bred, and here's where, this is a progressive idea. Yes, some other people are calling for the education of women at this time. As much as I, as a modern commentator, kind of chuckle a little bit at some of the things that Defoe says, it's a progressive idea. But it's only progressive to an extent. A woman well-bred and well-taught, furnished with the additional accomplishments of knowledge and behavior, is a creature without comparison. The man that has such a one to his portion has nothing to do but to rejoice in her and be thankful. A woman of sense and breeding will scorn as much to encroach upon the prerogative of the man as a man of sense will scorn to oppress the weakness of a woman. So why should we educate women? It's not for their, self-actualization. Let's put 20th century psychology aside. It's not because then they'll be fulfilled as individuals. It's really we educate them for the role that they will play. That role largely for Defoe being spouse, or daughter or sister, subordinate to men. Okay. And really well-educated people, women, they won't really want to, assume any prerogative that isn't theirs. Okay. The review. Each installment consisted of a longer essay, usually on politics of some sort, national or foreign affairs, and a shorter piece called Advice from the Scandalous Club. Not unlike Dear Abby, not unlike, don't ask me how I know this, some columns in women's magazines like Ask E. Jean. Yeah, none of you would read that. So I'm really glad. I don't know where I've seen it. The club dealt with questions in divinity, morality, love, state, war, trade, language, poetry, marriage, drunkenness, whoring, gaming, vowing, and the like. So they're pretty much going to comment on anything. I love this. The fiction was, of course, Defoe wrote these, but the fiction was that it was a group of men, and they were French. This is particularly interesting because, well, you know, let's just say the English and the French, a lot of tension throughout history. At this time, the sort of prevailing view of the French by the English is weak, Effeminate, interesting, often a word used in relation to the French at this time. Licentious. I have to use all these 18th century terms. Licentious. Nobody uses that word anymore, but I have to use it. It means essentially, what's the word I want? French. I want to choose my mother's terms, too, when I talk about conduct literatures. Things from the 60s and 50s. They were loose. They slept around a lot. So a lot of critics have looked at the fact that they're French and said that this was actually Defoe kind of really casting aspersions on the society of his time in England. It is so profligate, it is so awful, it is so out of control that even the French could school the English in manners. Okay. And this group says that they're drawn into difficult, nice, and unsatisfying work of resolving doubts, answering questions, and deciding controversies. Here's one of the things you have to know about conduct literature. The writer has to resolve a doubt, answer a question, decide a controversy. They can't be mealy-mouthed about it. It's yes or no. It's do it or don't do it. It's that's stupid or that's correct. Because otherwise, the author has no real moral authority. Conduct literature is not about moral nicety and kind of weighing both sides and, oh, you could be right, but sometimes you're wrong. It's you're right or you're wrong. Okay? Seriously, you don't look at a title of something like Conjugal Lewdness or one of Dr. Laura's books, 10 Stupid Things Women Do to Mess Up Their Lives, and think you're going to get subtlety, do you? No, it's kind of one of the reasons it's so much fun. I want to talk about some themes that we see in the review, and I'm going to try to subtly reach down into my bag. And I'm sure I'm off camera, and this will be very interesting television, but I'm going to get out some tea, and I need to take a drink here. Okay. This is a theme I'm calling the male of stark insensibility. The term sensibility is a wonderful term that the 18th century used. And without getting too exact about it, it's not unlike sensitivity. It's not unlike good sense. Sensibility, though, also implies fine feeling, moral feeling. If you're a heroine of sensibility in a novel, you're very well behaved, you're very virtuous, you're intelligent, and you're often actually persecuted, but that's another story. Insensibility is the opposite of sensibility. And stark insensibility, well, okay. I'd like to read you a quote from, oh, and by the way, there's been a lot of speculation about whether the letters that were sent to the Scandalous Club were real or not. You know, were they real people writing in and seeking advice, or were they inventions of Defoe and any of his cohorts? And to be honest, we don't know. But letter from a starkly insensible male. He doesn't know what to do. Oops. See, I get so excited. I, being a young man, and having unfortunately placed my affections upon one who disdains my amours, for what reason I know not, our fortunes and circumstances being near equal, but I being now under so great complexity of mind that it at present makes me incapable of minding my business, as to my worldly affairs, to my great disadvantage, and what adds more to my misfortunes, She is just upon the pitch of wedlock with another. So pray inform me, scandalous club, whether it is impossible to reclaim her. If not, what measures may be most proper to take? But if impossible, how shall I reclaim my lost thoughts? So, this is all written in wonderful 18th century language. Here's what's basically going on. The girl I love doesn't love me, and I don't get it because we're basically, we have the same fortunes and we're in similar social circumstances. So what's the big deal? She wants somebody else. Seriously, what can I do to get her back? And they have an answer. Perhaps she don't like you. Some of you are undoubtedly in the audience and you're saying, I think some of the grammar she's using is not correct. And on some of those slides, there's incorrect grammar. You are absolutely right. One of the wonderful things about the 18th century, one of the things I love about it, this is just a bonus for you here, so you know this. So the next time there's an 18th century class, you can take it. In the 18th century, there are wonderful people who start to actually standardize and come up with rules and conventions for grammar. But before, no. They didn't have the rules we have. The 18th century, yes, ladies and gentlemen, gives us the rules of grammar that we love. Isn't that fabulous? Yeah, that's not funny either. Okay. Lots of stories about this sort of insensible guy, gosh, I don't know what to do. And essentially, Defoe, as the voice of the scandalous club, is saying, you know what? It's her choice. And whether or not she actually likes you matters. And that doesn't sound radical to us, but it was a more radical view then. Another theme is a term that Defoe uses is the wife jobber. And this refers to those people who arranged marriages, who made they're matchmakers. And they do it for a price. It's kind of like getting your own personal shopper, only they're shopping for your spouse. And there are a lot of stories in the 18th century about unscrupulous wife jobbers who take money and run, make really inappropriate matches, marry young, innocent damsels to unscrupulous rakes. Rake is a wonderful term from the 18th century. It's an unscrupulous, profligate, licentious male. Okay. More of those wonderful 18th century words. The good, bad wife is another theme in the Scandalous Club columns. And the good, bad wife is really the woman that is being complained about. Lots of letters to the Scandalous Club that are complaints about how bad their wives are. What am I going to do with my wife? Tell me. She's so bad. Can I leave her? She's so bad. Can I have an affair with somebody else? Well, here's one of the responses from the Scandalous Club. She must be a real she-devil that a very good husband cannot reclaim. But I shall always be free to say, we cry out upon our wives' faults, generally before we mend our own. For shame, gentlemen, make no more complaints of these good, bad wives, but regulating your own conduct with, kindness and discretion, you must have very bad luck indeed if the worst of those wives do not mend on your hands. In other words, these wives that you perceive as bad are really good, and you know what? If you just treat them better, you probably wouldn't have a problem. Interestingly enough, in many of Dr. Laura's scenarios in her conduct books, I'm going to call them conduct books, you see her sort of taking the opposite view. When women write in and complain about their husbands, her view is essentially, and she's very blunt. Those of you who've listened to her, straighten up and fly right. and he won't be such a pain. And that's pretty much the way she would say it. So another theme. And then finally, this theme. I've always wanted to say this in a presentation. I'm not kidding you. Not kidding you. There is, one of the Scandalous Club columns is about, and the theme runs throughout it, old men essentially running after younger women, either to marry or to have illicit liaisons with. It's another wonderful kind of 18th century way to put it. And they denounce in one column the old buttock hunter. I just like that. And here is, I don't know if he's an old buttock hunter or not, but here is a slide from a series of engravings from the 18th century from the artist William Hogarth, who, famous artist, a painter and engraver, and two of his most famous series are called The Harlot's Progress and The Rake's Progress. And they are, in themselves, a kind of conduct manual. They're about how young men and young women who come to the City of London go bad. And anyway, I think she's gone bad. And he's a little older than she is, so I thought it was a nice way to put it. One of the ways that historians in this period characterize the new kind of marriage that is really coming to be is they call it the companionate marriage. It is very, very similar to how we consider marriage today, but again, it's a more revolutionary idea in its time. And the radical idea is that companionship, more than status or money or political affiliation, is the primary reason to get married, the most important thing to consider when choosing a spouse. And along with that is the notion that companionship and emotional satisfaction depend upon spouse and spouse having some things in common. Don't mistake this for a kind of modern sense that, I'm going to marry that guy because he likes 18th century British literature too. Or I'm going to marry that woman because we both want to grow up and work for Smith Barney. Or, gosh, we're both into water skiing, so we should get married. Doesn't really work quite like that. Because it's not a time where spouses are sort of best friends and doing things together and spending their lives as most spouses do now. But certainly, people would be encouraged to look for similarities in education, in temperament, in values, and still in station. The rarity is marrying outside of your social class. Although there are some famous novels in which that does happen. Affection should be present before marriage. It doesn't necessarily naturally develop after marriage. So that notion of parents arranging a marriage or families arranging a marriage, and gee, they'll come to like each other afterwards. It's becoming less and less prevalent. The tension, of course, is that those who advocated the companionate marriage, and many clergy did, many authors did, they also tended to advocate wifely submission. So companions, yes, but I'm a little more companion than you are. Okay. And we see that kind of idea of wifely submission in Defoe's earlier quotes about why women should be educated. So the companionate marriage is an important term to keep in mind and very much advocated in the conduct literature. Talk a little bit about conjugal lewdness. Conjugal lewdness is one of Defoe's last works. It's written in 1727. It is very, very shrill, and it's very shrill in its tone. There's no other way that I can really put it. Angry. Some critics have, in interesting language, referred to it as an old man's book. You know, it's the older person railing against the craziness of young people today. And so I think that view is interesting. Excuse me, just for a minute. When this work was first published as Conjugal Lewdness, many people did not like that. That was a title considered too scandalous for its time. And so Defoe, for a time it was called Matrimonial Whoredom, which is clearly better. And then eventually it was called The Uses and Abuses of the Marriage Bed, which is also clearly better. But now we just use all of them. And this is a book largely about sexuality and marriage. There's definite advocacy for the companionate marriage, but also support for the desirability of the extended family, the procreative imperative of intercourse, and the legal importance of inheritance. So, and basically sexual sin is still possible in Defoe's text between man and wife. So, there are certain things, equal sin, equal blame. And I'm still not sure how I feel about this. Is this really, really progressive or not? Is there any law that shows us the man had more indecent liberties allowed him than the woman? Not at all. The obligation is the same and the offense is the same. All indecent matrimony is mutual. Now, what would fall under the heading of indecent matrimony? It's not, you're married, anything goes. Defoe writes against people who essentially want sex too much. They're having too much sex. Not good. It's not moderate. It's not temperate. It doesn't show, moderation. Couples who are having sex without being open to the possibility of procreation. And by the way, Defoe is not a Catholic, and he is not saying this from a Catholic standpoint. He's saying it from what's called a dissenting religious view. Sodomy, inappropriate. Pretty much most, this is so difficult for me to talk about, most kinds of sexuality besides basic intercourse you should not be doing. That's what conjugal lewdness tells us. This notion of, all obligation the same, all offense the same is interesting. In other pieces, Defoe actually does very progressively speak out against rape in marriage. That is not he believes in the possibility that a husband could rape his wife. Very progressive, very unusual. A very progressive notion that I should have added a little bit earlier that Defoe held was the notion that children do have a say in who they marry. And he writes that the negative should belong to the parents, the father, in fact. So if a father sees a child about to marry somebody really, really inappropriate, he should be able to say no. But if a child, particularly a daughter, does not like who is courting her or who her father or mother may have in mind, she should have the ability to say no. Pretty progressive view for its time. The tension in the companionate marriage is pretty clear, as we've talked about, and I think it's really summed up in this quote from Conjugal Lewdness. I know too well who I am talking to and at what time of day. How the subordination of one sex is laughed at and bantered, and the dominion of the other abused and turned into tyranny and oppression. How the women, instead of submission, reign, and the men, instead of a government and love and a superiority of affection, in which that government should chiefly consist, insult and oppress their wives. So the appropriate order is getting out of balance, says Defoe, in some marriages. When the woman reigns, we're out of order. When the man oppresses with insults and abuse, instead of governing, head of the marriage, head of the state, in love, he is out of order. Things are out of balance. The dominion of men, the leadership of men, and the submission of women in marriage are right for Defoe, except when the power is abused by the man or it's usurped by the woman. All of the works that I've been talking about so far have been works that are primarily consist of precepts, the author's precepts on conduct. And a precept is a rule or principle for imposing a certain standard of action or conduct. You should do this. Men should govern in love. Women should not try to reign. No messing around outside of marriage. And I always think of precepts, you're going to shake a finger with them. They're statements of rules that you must follow. It's the thing, it is the stand of conduct literature. Remember, no hedging in conduct literature. Well, let's talk a little bit about how some hedging comes into the conduct literature. When we look at some of the conduct literature we're about to look at by Defoe, he introduces exempla, short stories, examples that are used to make a point or to illustrate the moral truth. And in telling the story, in introducing the story, Defoe makes the moral more ambiguous, the precept more ambiguous. Later in the talk, we'll talk a little bit about why this is. Not surprising, is it? Just in our common experience, when you state the moral, it's all clear and everybody agrees. But when you start to put it in a real life context of someone's experience, and you start to tell that, or you write it, and you sort of imaginatively embody it, it becomes something a little bit different and not as clear. So, precepts versus exempla. The family instructor. One of the comments that a lot of critics of 18th century literature make about the didactic nature of it is that modern audiences tend to find it kind of embarrassing. It makes you uncomfortable. I can't believe people are talking about this. And I can't believe people were so unenlightened. And these stories seem so stupid. And so it kind of makes us uncomfortable. And I don't know if you're feeling that, I have felt it in reading the work, or we see a title like The Family Instructor. No one would write a book entitled The Family Instructor now. Well, we write The Proper Care and Feeding of Marriage. That's different, but we're not going to call it The Family Instructor. It just sounds so didactic. Interestingly enough, Robinson Crusoe was the work of Defoe's that was most reprinted during his lifetime. The second most reprinted work was The Family Instructor. It was a very popular book in its time. Very, very popular. And it really focuses on tales of rebellious women. In particular, two irreligious wives married to devout men. And one of them, it was common in households to have evening prayers at this time. And in one of them, the wife wants to, one evening, let's forget family prayers for tonight. I'm ready to go to bed. Sometimes I'm not so quick on the uptake when I'm reading literature, I have to confess to you. But I'm thinking she wasn't just tired. Could be me, Actually, other critics agree with me. There's kind of a sexual undertone there. And the father says, well, we can't do that. That's not a good model. Ultimately, this woman is so angry in kind of a shake your fist, almost perverse desire for liberty. And she says, I want my liberty. It seems such an odd thing to assert your liberty over. There might be something more than, I just don't want to go to prayers tonight. I want my liberty. She ends up in this story, I kid you not, trust me, you can find this. You can buy it on Amazon.com today. There's going to be a run on Defoe, I can tell, after this talk, a run on Defoe on Amazon.com. She abandons the family. She says, you know what, I'm going to just pack it up. I'm going to go live with my friend, the socialite. And they have all this fun, and they have all this fun. But this is, the conduct manual is Defoe's cleansed universe. She goes and lives her life with her socialite friend. And she starts getting into some bad habits. And one of her friend's favorite sayings is, poison it. When she's mad, she'll poison it. So we've got some really women here. Poison it. And the friend, our irreligious wife, starts to say that. And so one night, she has a dream. And in it, she thinks, poison him. She wakes up appalled at what she has just dreamt. She's thinking about poisoning her husband. She nearly goes crazy, and she decides to repent. She goes home, everything's fine. Nice ending. It all nicely, cleanly works itself out. Thank goodness. The other one, she's okay with prayers, but she thinks she could do them better. The wife did not lead family prayers in the 18th century household. So she's really upset. Again, you look at this almost perverse. Couldn't you pick something better to rebel about? Her rebellion is that while he's leading prayers, she decides to interrupt him, so she'll do things like act like she's sleeping. She'll bring a book and read something else. It's just silly. Of course, none of us has ever seen that kind of thing happen. Acts out through totally childish shenanigans. Finally, the husband has had enough with her, kicks her out of prayers, and locks the door. That does the trick. She actually, because she has been locked out of the family circle, figuratively, locked out of the family of man, she goes insane. Spends some time in an asylum, comes around to her right way of thinking, and she too rejoins the family, and everything's fine. Okay. These are to a modern reader, these are funny stories. Do we think an 18th century audience would have chuckled at some of this? I can't imagine not, but I wasn't alive then. Women must be subordinate. Those who are not and who try to usurp the male authority are, in these cases, perverse, unnatural. They go insane. It's dangerous. Not keeping female desire and submission in check is dangerous. The full title of Religious Courtship is, you see it here. This is a text that is very much based on the idea that you must marry someone of your own, not just who's religious, of your own religion. And in the 18th century, of course, that had political implications. If you married a Catholic, who would have been a papist, would have been the term, follower of the Pope, you would be of a certain political persuasion as well. If you were, something else, you would be something else. So very much the focus here is on marrying the right partner, they must be religious. Interestingly enough, any followers of Dr. Laura know she's very, very stringent on this as well. In the 21st century, I think a lot of people look at this and find it a bit quaint, outdated. Dr. Laura would not have anyone marry outside of their own religion. I want to leave some time for questions, so I'm going to kind of speed through this. You can see some of the scenarios that you see in religious courtship, very much concerned with how daughters marry. And I want to particularly look at the second story, in which one of the daughters marries a wonderful man. He's benevolent, he's kind, but he's a papist. And so she's miserable. Everything else is perfect. Doesn't do anything bad. Marries a papist, rotten marriage, terrible, father sees it, has to do better for the third daughter. These stories from the family instructor, from religious courtship, from conjugal lewdness, are all told in story form, not as precepts. A couple of stories from conjugal lewdness. One is about what Defoe calls the assembly of barren does, women who don't have children. Worse yet, women who don't want children. Worse yet, women who will take steps to not have children. And those women, particularly one of them who is featured in a tale, are women who Defoe says would only keep a stallion. This is not a nice thing to say. I want to focus on that story and not so much the second one I've noted here. This again becomes, this story becomes almost lurid in tone as Defoe tells it. Gleeful, taking glee, authorial glee in the fact that this woman is a woman who would only keep a stallion, ends up getting her comeuppance. What happens is that she is so desirous to not have children that she asks one of her friends for a drug that will help her to not get pregnant. The friend is appalled, tries to talk her out of it, says, "I can't believe you would do something like this," says, this is the fate of all women, so submit. But ultimately gives her something which is simply a placebo. Friend moves off to conveniently moves off to the country for a couple years. Woman who takes the placebo, thinks it's real, has terrible, terrible, terrible regrets, is driven to distraction, confesses, this is so stupid, to her mother-in-law. Seriously. Like, you read that, the modern reader just goes there, you know that's a mistake. Confesses to the mother-in-law, who then immediately, help me out, folks, you know the story, tells her son, who wants to then divorce his wife. All in the end, the woman feels such emotional turmoil, such mental distress, nearly drives herself to distraction, that she repents. Conveniently, at this point, the friend comes back from the country and says, "Oh, it was just a placebo, don't worry," and they all have children and live happily ever after. And Defoe's glee at this story, ha, 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 that evil woman got tricked, is just kind of interesting to look at. Precepts and exempla in Defoe's conduct literature. The exempla, to a limited extent in these pieces, employ novelistic techniques. They are mostly written in dialogue, a little bit of some narrative interludes, mostly dialogue. So it doesn't read like a novel, but it doesn't read like a precept. And one of the things that make these pieces a bit novelistic is characters groping their way toward understanding, talking it out, rather than characters being just an obvious mouthpiece for Defoe, the moralist's view. As you read these, and maybe someday you will, you would see that in some cases, not in all, you get a very much a sense of some grudging admiration from Defoe for these transgressing women. Certainly, if you've read any of his novels about women, and we'll make some reference to those later, you would see that he certainly does have some more than grudging admiration for the female outlaw. And you start to kind of see it here. And these actually become a bit more morally ambiguous than some of Defoe's other blunt statements. One critic has said that in the exempla of the conduct novels, modern readers surreptitiously find morsels of forbidden fruit among tables laden with dull, didactic gruel. I think it's true, frankly. And in these rebellious women of the conduct books, we see the forerunners of Moll Flanders and Roxana. Take a brief break for a moment. Anybody read Moll Flanders? It would be the most, of the two, it would be the most likely that people had read. Moll Flanders? Do you love it? Yeah? Do you think, let me ask Professor Weingarten, do you think Defoe had some serious empathy for Moll Flanders?
You know, I read that book high school, so it has been so long, I don't feel comfortable.
Oh, okay. You could just agree with me.
Okay, I'll agree.
Woo, look, I'm right, okay. Okay. Some other 18th century works that partake of the spirit of the conduct manuals. William Law's Serious Call to a Devout and Holy Life. Hogarth's engravings that I referenced earlier. Novels of sensibility, the sensitive woman who faces the perils of a very predatory male world. And James Fordyce's Sermons to Young Women. I'm going to read just a snippet of that in a minute. But first I want to reference Samuel Richardson's novel, Pamela. It is the classic tale of the persecuted heroine. It is a tale in which a young servant girl named Pamela is working in the home of the evil rake aristocrat, Squire B. And it is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages, persons of quality, of Squire B trying to seduce Pamela. And of course, she is Pamela, subtitle, or Virtue Rewarded. And of course, Pamela holds him off, holds him off, holds him off for hundreds of pages. And then finally, through her moral example, he is converted. He sees the light, and he becomes good. And he asks her to marry him. Servant girl marries the aristocrat. And she says what?
She says no. At first.
At first? Mm-hmm. No. No. Ultimately, she says yes. And the modern audience is like, oh. Wonderful example of this notion that you see in conduct literature of the morally transformative power of a woman. A good woman can transform even the rottenest guy in the conduct literature. Oh, we're going to make a little switch here to Dr. Laura. And again, I'm going to go to the happy bag, my bag of tricks. I'm going to pull out Scots Presbyterian clergyman James Fordyce writes sermons for young women. And we were talking about that transformative power of the virtuous female. By the way, modern romance novels, common theme, isn't it? Isn't it? A really good woman can convert a really rotten man. You know what Dr. Laura would say to that? Anybody? There's got to be some familiarity in this audience with Dr. Laura. Yes? Little bit? Clearly, I need to update my reading. Dr. Laura would say to the woman who says, "But I can change him." Don't be stupid. That's what she'd say. James Fordyce, in an essay to women to warn them against too much ornament. I guess so they don't look like pleasure in the choice of Hercules. Don't wear too much makeup because men don't really like that. But this is on the transformative power of women. To form the manners of men, various causes contribute. Manners meaning behaviors, conduct. But nothing I apprehend so much as the turn of the women with whom they converse. Most powerful influence on men, the women they converse with. Those who are most conversant with women of virtue and understanding will be always found the most amiable characters, other circumstances being supposed alike. Such society, beyond everything else, rubs off the corners that give many of our sex an ungracious roughness. It produces a polish more perfect and more pleasing than that which is received from a general commerce with the world. The virtuous woman takes those rough edges off, guys. Best education in the world. Interaction with virtuous women. I just think that's kind of fun. And an example that conduct literature can deal with many, many aspects of what would, in the 18th century, be called manners, behaviors, conduct. Not manners in the modern sense of which fork do I use for my salad, but manners in a more broad sense of behavior and conduct. And we'll just take a moment. And I'll ask if up to this point there are any questions about 18th century conduct literature or Defoe in particular. Dr. Lerner.
I think it was on the first slide about conjugal lewdness that this thought struck me. It seems like in the 18th century there's a connection between the controlling of sexual behavior, even within marriage, and property. Is that so? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. One of the main reasons to control sexual behavior in marriage is to make sure that inheritance, proper lines of inheritance are carried out. So if you have a woman with an illegitimate child, that obviously, if that child were to inherit and no one were to know, that becomes a bad thing for the social order. So maintaining children's legitimacy and then a legitimate line of inheritance is definitely one of the reasons for, talk about regulation of desire, for regulating desire even within marriage. I'm sorry, another, Susan?
Yeah, sure. Is there a female response, a written response to people like Defoe during that period?
There are some. I can't think of any right now that are direct, that are clearly direct, a female direct response to a certain piece of literature of Defoe. There are certainly female authors in the time who do write some conduct manuals. One of them is Mary Estelle, who writes a serious proposal for the ladies. It's a tract on female education. There are this is an odd term to use for a female author, but Aphra Behn is a rather rakish female author. Through her works, you see, for want of a better term, some kind of proto-feminism and an even more progressive view about what female behavior could be. Certainly narratives which would reflect far less regulation of female desire and show the consequences of that. So, other questions at this point? Think about these themes that we talked about: regulation of desire, maintaining the status quo, and that choice of Hercules. And what's the choice you could make? Because desire is associated with self. and with what the 18th century would view as the wrong side of that equation. Professor DeVivo.
It's interesting to see that Defoe's commentaries on conduct occurred really before the middle of the 18th century, before the Industrial Revolution really was established in London. And I'm wondering if if his commentaries were discussed in the second half of the 18th century, for there was discussion among some students and theologians concerning this tremendous population increase in London, and there was concern about human behavior and this explosion in population, such as with Thomas Malthus. So I'm wondering if there's any evidence of these guys talking about Defoe's commentaries, or if he was discussed, or had he just, had his time passed with his death?
I don't have a really good answer for that. I'm not aware of a lot of conversation about Defoe's conduct manuals. I'm not aware of any in the latter half of the 18th century. It doesn't mean that there wouldn't have been. You do see, even in the Restoration in the early 18th century, you see even in some of Defoe's writing and in some of the other, if you take Hogarth's engravings as conduct literature, and I do and many others do, you do see a concern with urbanization, the growth of London. London is a den of iniquity. Very kinds of classic in the literature. They could be almost French. So I guess I don't know. Robinson Crusoe obviously is the enduring work. In the late 20th and early 21st century, a lot of literary critics come back to Defoe's conduct literature as you see, the rise of feminism in the U.S. and feminism as we understand it now. So, okay. Shall we chat a little bit about Dr. Laura? I'm going to confess to a guilty pleasure. Shocking, I know. There was a time, I actually kind of enjoy Dr. Laura. I don't know if that's the most fashionable thing to say. But I enjoy her for some different reasons. I certainly, would not personally espouse every position she takes. And I'm not so sure that some of my attraction to Dr. Laura, her works, isn't some of my attraction to Defoe's literature, and to that sense that, conduct literature is about the right and the wrong, and there's no hedging, and it's really pretty simple, pretty easy to digest. For a time, a period of a couple of years, I would always run my errands on Thursday mornings. So I'm out in the car doing this and that and doing this and that. And once a week, when I was out doing that, I had to turn on Dr. Laura. And the thing that I really liked, and that was kind of fun, is that she really tells people off. I think some of the secret pleasure of conduct literature is watching other people be told what to do. Some of you are laughing, some of you are appalled. I'm sorry, it's a guilty confession. But for those of you who are, I guess some of you aren't familiar with Dr. Laura and aren't one of her 8.25 million listeners weekly, haven't been out to the drlaura.com website or Dr. Laura on YouTube, I just discovered this morning. She's a popular author of, I don't think they're self-help. I think self-help is a whole other genre that's all about the pleasure equation of the choice of Hercules. Don't get me wrong, I don't think it's bad, but I think it's more about the I than it is about society. There's my generalization for the day. She's written some children, PhD in physiology, postdoctoral certification in counseling, been in private practice as a counselor. She's taught at various universities, and she is very proud to say she is a stay-at-home mom. Sailboat racer, black belt in the martial arts. I wouldn't mess with her. Married and one son in the military right now. Some of her she's written many more books than this. 10, and she tends to write them in delightful pairs. This is very 18th century, you know. Choice of Hercules, love, honor. 10 stupid things women do to mess up their lives. 10 stupid things men do to mess up their lives. How could you do that? The abdication of character, courage, and conscience. This was one of the more controversial. I gotta tell you, to the modern audience, even the title, I feel myself kind of, you know. Proper care and feeding of husbands. Proper care and feeding of marriage. And then her latest work in praise of stay-at-home moms. You know, see, what I noticed right away is that there is no proper care and feeding of wives. And in fact, my understanding is that Dr. Laura has said she probably will not write that book because really, in marriages, women hold most of the power. You know, we're running out of time today, but we could spend a long time unpacking that one, couldn't we? Yeah. I want to actually, because one of the things I find so delightful about, delightful in an unusual sense about Dr. Laura is her tone and her language. Obviously, I can't give you an audio tape of Defoe, but I can try with Dr. Laura. And so if you would humor me while I do my best to play with technology here. I may need to call on my able assistant. But let's see if I can do this. And we're going to hear from Dr. Laura here, if I can pull this off. These days, most women are pigs. Seriously, who could turn that down? We have to listen to that one. Again, nothing subtle about
Dr.
this.
Laura Schlesinger, welcome again to our YouTube channel, which we answer your questions and show you my dog and the people I work with, and we have all kinds of things happening here, so always check it, always check it. I was raised by my grandma listening to you. I remember growing up hearing that all too often women strive for short-term gratification instead of long-term satisfaction. Now I'm ready to turn 30 and could really use a refresher in that course. Is there any way I can receive an update or something to refresh my own memory on these talks? It would be the utmost and helpful as to where I am in life, trying to remember about what was said about long-term satisfaction. Wow, this is so timely, because these days most women out there are pigs. Are you shocked that I said that? Do you think I'm talking about you? I might be. Is it 1, 2, 3 minutes, 3 hours, 3 days, 3 dates, and you're already having sex with somebody you don't know? That's the short-term gratification. That's the pretending there's a relationship. That's the pretending that somebody gives a darn about you. That's the pretending that somebody respects you, cares about you. You know what? Here's the deal. You know he's in love with you when he wants to protect you more than he simply wants to do it to you. Not that he'll stop wanting to do it to you, but you're getting my drift. So the short-term imaginary satisfaction that I have a boyfriend and he's in love with me because he's doing it with me all the time might make your ego feel good, but then again, after a while, when he gets bored and I get the call going, I don't know what happened, I thought we were so close, I loved him, instead of actually getting to know somebody. I went to an Orthodox, super duper Orthodox Jewish wedding one time. This couple had known each other for a year, had not even touched fingers, not even handing somebody an ice cream cone that fingers can accidentally touch, nothing, no touching. They spent a year talking, doing things together with chaperones, really getting to know one another, developing awe and admiration and respect and a whole lot of excitement. The wedding was the first time they touched each other. And she has a veil, and he can't see her, and then they reveal a veil, and we do some of that in generalized weddings, and she walks around him 3 times. Glasses are broken. I mean, it is beautiful. And for the first time, the relationship becomes physical. But it becomes physical in a context, and that's what so many of you don't understand when you're going for the immediate gratification. And you guys too, because girls are making it so easy. You're just doing one girl after another and wondering why it doesn't mean anything. Because sex without a foundation of love and admiration gets boring. And that's why you move on to the next girl or the next guy. So really, try to get to know someone, because ultimately, if you're going to be with them for 50, 60 years till death do you part, a very small...
Oops. Well, we heard the good part. I need my bifocals improved, so. Can you help me get rid of my trim? Thanks, Susan. I'm so caught up in my 18th century world that I don't come out that often, so technology is still quite a problem for me, but I'm hoping to do better. I almost think that if you imagine the picture of Defoe earlier with the periwig and the whole thing, you could imagine him almost saying that in his conjugal lewdness, shake your fist kind of a way. Want to just kind of talk about some of the stupid things with reference to specific precepts that Dr. Laura would have. And certainly, on her radio show or on YouTube or in her book, she tells brief stories. And they're told from really the point of view of the caller. It's the caller's words. These really aren't exempla in the sense that we're talking about with Defoe. Dr. Laura is not imaginatively putting herself in the story. She is responding to the story, and therefore she is looking at these from a simply preceptual kind of position. You don't get a lot of empathy with Dr. Laura. And she talks about, for women, stupid attachment to men who aren't worth the attachment, stupid cohabitation, sex outside of marriage, stupid helplessness. She does not like helpless women. All kinds of stupidity. Stupid things for men. Stupid chivalry. She says a man going out of his way to find a dysfunctional woman who can't take care of herself. In fact, I think it's easy if we haven't looked at a fair amount of Dr. Laura's work to think, she's all about women are pigs, women should be submissive, and there is that element to her work. And it's a strong element in the proper care and feeding of husbands. I mean, she is very much men are men and women are women, and it's that kind of notion of dominion and submission, not exactly like Defoe's, but not wholly different, that, one must let the man be masculine, and being masculine means, having a certain authority. But she talks about, in that vein of maybe being a little bit more progressive in views about women, she talks about why would a man want to marry a woman who has never lived on her own and never taken care of herself? How can she be an equal partner in the marriage if she couldn't take care of herself? Just as it's easy to be simplistic about what Defoe was, it's easy to be simplistic about what Dr. Laura's. Stupid chivalry, stupid sex, I think it's obvious what that is. Stupid boyishness, she essentially says, get over your mommy issues. Stupid machismo, we can imagine the examples. Interestingly, proper care and feeding of husbands. I think here's where the modern reader may get a bit more the blood pressure may rise a little bit. Men need women, and women have power, hence we don't really need to write the proper care and feeding of wives. Men and women are different. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. It's that same idea now taken to what I consider to be a conduct manual. Neglecting your spouse is a kind of infidelity, not paying enough attention. Women shouldn't dismiss the importance of sex in marriage. Women should appreciate masculinity. And women should not covet. That is, they shouldn't think. And if you've listened to Dr. Laura at all, she pretty much spits out the word feminism. She can barely get it out. If you're a feminist and you think that you can have it all, you're wrong, so stop trying. Interestingly, in the conduct literature of Defoe and Dr. Laura, some common scenarios that are very, you'd think that the scenarios would be radically different. They are sometimes, they're not at others. In both the review and in How Could You Do That, people call in or write in, if my spouse won't have sex with me, can't I go find it elsewhere? Or, if my partner wants to have sex with other people, shouldn't I, I'm married, shouldn't I let that happen? And no lack of sarcasm on either Defoe's or Dr. Laura's part. Defoe's answer, because your victuals is locked up, must you steal your neighbors? And Dr. Laura, oh, please. One has a need to eat, breathe, drink water. There is no need to, and this is a quote, screw everything that isn't nailed down. And then she apologizes for the crudeness of the description. Similar kinds of situations. They also address these kinds of similar issues, have similar responses. I think given what you know about Dr. Laura and what we've discussed about Defoe, you know what the answers would be. Both would agree you don't marry someone of a different religion. Neither would ever condone abortion. Is it ever acceptable to leave your spouse? Both would say yes, but in far fewer circumstances than would commonly be acceptable in modern society. Abuse, yes, you could leave, or in Dr. Laura's case, divorce. I mean, there are reasons why you would do that. Defoe, another very progressive tendency of Defoe is that although a woman could not get a divorce in his time, he would definitely advocate for women leaving their husbands if they were very, very abusive, but living with people of impeccable character so that their reputations wouldn't be stained. Some comparison contrast. The difference I think the big difference with Defoe is that when he assumes a fictional female voice in some of his conduct literature, in his novels, they lose their moral certainty. And so in Moll Flanders and Roxana, much more morally indeterminate. It's not a right or wrong. The heroines are struggling with moral absolutes in a world of great uncertainty, a predatory world, a world absolutely hostile to women. Although the novels have a clearly stated didactic aim, there is no clear moral message in either. Just covers of the novels. The characters of Moll Flanders and Roxana are androgynous in nature. In their female side, they begin as kind of conduct book heroines. Life circumstances, seduction, abuse, abandonment, leave them in a real world where they have to become far more predatory themselves. They become female outlaws, quite literally, thieves, prostitutes, courtesans, you name it, they do it, while their creator, in assuming their voice, in writing the first-person narrative as a woman, becomes the author in petticoats. one of the interesting cultural phenomena of the 18th century is the popularity of an entertainment called a masquerade. Enormously popular in London in particular. They have European, therefore licentious origins. And they're a place where you can go. Obviously, you have the mask on. We all know what a masquerade is. And where essentially in that situation of anonymity, you could do whatever you wanted. And it happened at masquerades. Licentiousness, liaisons between people of different social classes, liaisons, homosexual liaisons, liaisons of adulterous liaisons, you name it. Very much a target of the moralists of the time, very much an influence on the novel, and many critics would say very much an influence on the 18th century male author who assumes that first-person fictional female voice. Lots of critics have talked about this. They've talked about it as narrative transvestism. There are actually some very also influencing interpretations of these novels are real-life examples of people who cross-dressed and passed in the 18th century. In fact, the daughter of one of the major poets of the time, Colley Cibber, for many years dressed as a man and passed and even got married. Colley Cibber's daughter. What happens with this authorial cross-gender identification is of course, it's never perfect. It's always problematic, but in Defoe's work, it can be achieved to a remarkable degree, results in a great deal of empathy for his heroines, and a brief coda on this whole notion of empathy, moralism, and conduct. We do know who these, yes, at least the guy on the right. Who's the guy on the left?
He's the senator where he went off on a trip, but he told his wife he was, anyway, he went off to be with his mistress.
Yeah. Governor Mark Sanford of South Carolina, who has done a very public apology for his affairs with an Argentinian woman. Dave Letterman, of course, in the news recently admitting his affairs with various female staffers. We've been talking a lot in relation to conduct literature about the rigidity of right and wrong, and we've been talking about how when you get to stories, primarily those in which the author develops a certain empathy for the creation, you get a much more morally problematic universe. That, you know, in its simplest form, when you get that kind of author in petticoats or narrative transvestite or whatever you want to call it, you get some empathy in the story and you get some empathy for the characters. When, you know, in the simplest, most cliched sense, when we put ourselves in another person's shoes, we get empathy. And certainly the conduct literature lends itself to a very moralistic tone and very moralistic positions. And I just kind of think it's interesting as we look at this tension of love and honor, as we look at precepts in our world versus the real stories, the exempla, how our notions and our reactions to situations change. And for me, it's fascinating. I'm hardly the first person to recognize this. Mark Sanford was absolutely skewered when he came forward and admitted his extramarital affairs. And one of the key reasons was that he had been so condemnatory of the affairs of other politicians, most notably Bill Clinton. And audiences don't tend to like the moralizer who falls from grace. David Letterman, highest ratings in a long time for the shows in which he admits his transgressions. I can only attribute some of that to the fact that he certainly spent his life making fun and making fun of individuals, but he hasn't spent it in serious moralizing about the behaviors of other people. So some of these issues that we talk about in the conduct literature, frankly, some of the issues that make them fun in some pretty innocent ways, and some of the issues that make them really, you know, it doesn't show the best side of human nature as we look and judge other people come through, are still present in situations today, in literature today, and in general life today. And so I appreciate this opportunity very much. I think I've gone 2 minutes over. I hope you will forgive me and only attribute it to my enthusiasm for the topic. Go read some Defoe.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chesley. And thank you all for coming to the opening session of what is, again, a 3-day event. If you have just a minute, please do let us know your thoughts on the comment sheets that we handed out at the start. I have extra copies up here if you didn't get one. And our next event today starts at 1:15, and please come back and hear Laurie Creed from Indiana University discuss the 20th century discussion of sex, right, based on her research on the Kinsey Institute. Thank you all.